Hello, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today is June 13th, 2022, and I am making this video just to kind of give a timeline so you can kind of get an idea of how things have progressed in this country and how we've become so desensitized to violence. Yes, so the Uvalde shooting was a few weeks ago, and there was a fourth grader in that class who survived and was interviewed on a news station in Houston. And one of the things that he said when the killer came in the room, he said, "It's time to die." And then he started shooting. And if you do a quick search of "It's Time to Die," what you'll find is pretty telling. It is the title of a song that was written for the Five Nights at Freddy's horror franchise. Yes, and there's another survivor who reportedly said that before he shot one of the teachers, he said goodnight. And a quick search of goodnight horror, and you'll find that that is connected to a lot of really violent entertainment, games, stories, movies. And that's not saying that this was the catalyst that caused him to murder all of these children. This is just one of the inspiring factors. There are a number of things that contribute to violence in this country, and not just mass murder, but all violence in this country. There are some really main weeds of evil that contribute to that, and this is just one of them, and I think it's actually one of the minor ones. But it's something that can be taken care of quickly and immediately. Like, we can immediately do something about it. We can immediately put standards in our schools that say teachers can't show graphic violence to kids. We could immediately put standards on television and our rating system and make it so that content that's psychologically damaging to children and adolescents is less accessible. There was a Supreme Court ruling in the 70s when media was just, the rating system wasn't very old, and there wasn't a lot of data collected yet on the effects of graphic violence on children and adolescents. And the Supreme Court ruled that it would violate free speech. But I think in this case, it's not a violation of free speech. This is a product that's being marketed. People make money off of it. And some of the content is really damaging to minds that aren't fully developed yet. And the human brain isn't fully developed until about 24, 25 years old. That's when the brain is really fully developed. So those years before then are very influential years. And there has to be a standard. We protect children from tobacco products. We protect them from alcohol. You can't drive a car without a license. You can't rent a car until you're 24. You can't join the military until you're 17. And there are just things that aren't suitable for children that may or may not be suitable for adults, but adults, ultimately, your brain's fully developed, you have to make your own decisions. And people need the freedom to make their own decisions, but children need to be protected from things that are damaging. So I'm gonna start in the 1920s. So in the 1920s, there were 8 mass murders, and mass murder is being defined as a murder where 3 or 4 or more die, including the murderer. World War I was 1917, 1918. So this is right after World War I. 1920s, 8 mass murders on record in the United States. And public radio was kind of born then. It just started being available to the public, to civilians. 1930s, there were three mass murders. And in the 1930s, that's when experimental TV became a thing with sporadic broadcasts. Like, some areas could kind of get it. It wasn't a widespread thing. 1940s, 3 mass murders. So 3 again. World War II is happening in the 40s. In 1942 to 1945, they actually stopped all progression in television for civilians. So it was focused on government and military affairs. during that time. In 1946, it was opened back up to the public, and the first commercial network formed. I believe, I want to say it was NBC or CBS, but it might be WDTV. I don't remember, and I didn't write it down for some reason. 1946, first commercial network is formed, and there was actually a cable that was completed from New York to DC. So it was the first kind of cable network that stretched out so they could have chain broadcasting, where they could broadcast something from DC and you could see it in New York or vice versa, and the areas in between. In 1948, about 1 million homes in the United States had a television. There were about 108 licensed channels, but only 2 or 3 available in different areas and very choppy. 1949, the first horror film was shown on TV. That was when the first horror film was aired. I believe the first horror film was made in the late 1800s, but the first showing on TV was in 1949. In the 1950s, there were 4 mass murders, and we had the Cold War starting then and the Vietnam War. It was the beginning of news broadcasts. Like, that's when the news really started being broadcast on television. In 1951, there were 4 major networks that had formed, and they stretched from coast to coast: WDTV, CBS, NBC, and ABC. 1953, 50% of US households had televisions. 1960s, there was a lot that happened in the 1960s. So there were 7 mass murders, so still not a great increase. We went 8, 3, 3, 4, and now 7. But the 1960s were a really pivotal time in the United States. We had the Vietnam War still happening, and it was called the Living Room War. It was the first war that was referred to as a living room war because people could watch what was going on television. Westerns started to decline. They weren't so popular, and medical dramas and police dramas became really popular. So people were really kind of craving that drama, which kind of shows you our thirst for pain, like for watching agony and pain. So medical dramas and police dramas became a big thing. And in 1963 to 1967, news broadcasts expanded from 15 minutes to 30 minutes. Can you imagine a world where news was only 15 minutes a day? Like, now we have it nonstop all day, but where news was 15 minutes, so it expanded to 30 minutes. 1965, 94% of American homes had TVs. In 1968, the rating system was introduced, and it was originally G for general audience or M for mature, but they were noticing an uptick in content that really wasn't good for children, and so they developed a more broad rating system, and they added the R rating, which was restricted. And in general, back then, kids really just didn't get in to see R-rated movies. The first R-rated movie was a movie called Greeting. It was not a violent movie. It was rated R for sexual content. So we have Vietnam going on here too. Korean War is happening. My grandfather fought in both of those, and my great uncle. But there were a few other factors that were coming into play here. There was the factor of fatherlessness. It was at about 8%. So you had 8% of kids growing up without dads. And some of that was from war, and some of that was just dads not being present in the home. More divorces happening. And yeah, this number is more for fathers that are alive. Like, during the World Wars, there were a lot of kids that didn't have fathers because they had died. But this started being a problem where fathers are alive and they're just not present. And not because they're necessarily out on the job, but because the family was breaking apart. But 8%, not a huge percentage, but 8%. We also had Roe v. Wade, which, whether or not you're a proponent of abortion, whether or not you agree with that, to make a statement like that, where at some point human life doesn't matter, it affects the psychology of children. When they see that being a broad thing, when their mom comes home and, just came home from rights for free choice rally. The message that's being sent to kids is you're lucky you're alive, and at some point your life didn't matter. Like, that's the message that's being sent home, that human life doesn't matter at some point. Also, prayer was restricted. And I hear a lot of Christians say, well, they kicked God out of school and so God left. God doesn't leave. Like, he's not going to leave children especially. But what happened there is a law was passed, and I actually agree with it, that schools could not create a prayer and force students to say it. And I 100% agree with that. No one should be forced into any faith, into practicing any faith. That was exaggerated and lied about, misconstrued to mean that prayer wasn't allowed in schools. And so a lot of people quit praying in schools. And the problem with that, whether you're a person of faith or not, is you remove a subconscious awareness that there is a moral authority outside of yourself. It doesn't matter if you believe in Jesus or if you believe in Allah or whatever you believe in, if you're an atheist. When there is a time set aside at the beginning of a school day, when everyone is quiet and that time is designated for prayer or reflection, or the kid wants to take a nap, but if there's that underlying thought that this sign was designated to communicate with a God, someone who holds a moral standing and might hold you accountable for that, that kind of stays in the subconscious of your mind. You kind of have this undertone of, I don't believe in God if you don't believe in God. But what if, what if I'm actually held accountable in the end for my actions? And so it kind of sets a tone for the day, whether or not you believe it or not. Yes, so that came into play. All right, so 1970s, we jump from going 3, 4, 7, 8 mass shootings, we jump to 19. So it more than doubles to 19 mass shootings in the 70s. We still had Vietnam War trailing off. In 1976, the first violent video game was released. It was called Death Race. I don't think it was real graphic or gory, but it was the first one that really got ridiculed for being violent. I am not against video games. I'm not actually against fighting games. I am against super graphic, gory, evil games like Grand Theft Auto. I am against children playing Call of Duty. There have been a lot of studies done on this, there's a therapeutic aspect to playing a fighting game that can actually be beneficial to soldiers that are suffering from PTSD. And it's something that actually helped me. Not a gory game, not an evil game. When my husband and I were building our house, that's a stressful situation. There's just a lot of angst that goes into building a house together. A lot of marriages don't survive it. And there was an Incredible Hulk game that came out at the same time, and I Hulk smashed my way through building that house. Like, when I was real frustrated, I would just get on there and I would be the Incredible Hulk and I would tear down buildings and I beat the game. And it wasn't a game where I was killing humans. It wasn't a game with blood and guts. It wasn't a game where people were being raped or police were being killed. But it was a smash game, and it was something that helped me release that tension. So there's some benefit there, but there has to be, you have to use, I would say common sense, but it just doesn't, it's not common anymore. You have to really look at the core of it, and is this an evil act? Is this an evil thing that I'm portraying on this screen? And is it appropriate for me and my mindset? Is it appropriate for my children to see? And I think as our country detoxes from the violence and becomes sensitive to it again, there will be this realization of, oh, that's really not, it's probably not acceptable for my first grader to be, playing Grand Theft Auto. It's probably not a good idea. It's not a good idea for anyone to be playing Grand Theft Auto. Yeah. Anyways. So, yes, so we had that. And then 1980s, we went from 19 in the 70s to 22 in the 80s. Not a huge jump here. This was the time period of the 70s, 60s, 70s, the Jesus music. And I think that made an impact because people were focusing again on a moral source outside of themselves. In the 1980s, 1984, we had the first PG-13 movie. So people started realizing that they were really pushing the limit of what was between G and R and decided to make a PG-13 rating because some of this stuff might be okay for teenagers, but it was most definitely not okay for a general audience that could contain little kids. So that was Red Dawn. 1986, the Fox Broadcasting Network launched, 21st Century Fox, not necessarily the news agency. That came a little bit later. Or it might have been then. Anyways, CNN was the first national news broadcasting agency, and that was in the 80s. And this is also not to say anything bad about news. We need to know the news. But it definitely impacts your morale. It impacts how you're feeling if all you're getting is negativity all day long. And it also affords way too much power to certain entities to spin things the way they want you to see them and demonize certain things and prop up other things. But if you watch the news nonstop, you will be depressed because that's just what it causes. We really need like a happy hour, like an hour of television where it's all bunnies and cats and laughing and comedy and baby giggles, and yeah, that would be great. Okay, so also 1986, we had the first video game with blood and gore. It was called Chiller. The graphics are still not great then, but yeah, that came about. We had the Panama War going on, which was short. I remember that war because there was a point in time where I thought my dad was being deployed, and he wasn't, but I remember that moment. I'll never forget it. Also, satellite TV was introduced, and this was a big game changer. So we move on to the 90s. In the 90s, we had 31 mass murders. We had the Gulf War happening. We now have live TV via satellite, so we could watch things going on. I remember watching this. Like, we could watch it live. We could watch the bombs being dropped. In 1990, 98% of households had more than one TV. There was a huge increase in violent gaming. I mean, it just blew up in the 90s. And you see this, you can also see it in crime charts. If you look at overall crime and not just child crime, you'll see charts that just go way up in the 90s and then they start to come back down. The child crime chart continues to climb, but overall crime, it kind of peaked right there. And I believe part of that was because we had this boom in entertainment and we didn't know how to handle it. I mean, we had just tons of horror franchises popping up. We had directors who were realizing what they could do with computer animation and all these special effects, and everyone was competing with each other, and the most thrilling movies made the most money, and so they just got more bloody and more gory and more graphic, and it just really boomed then. And the awareness of how this affected children it just wasn't something people thought about too much. We most definitely didn't have it in the schools. We did not watch R-rated films in the schools, at least not in my school. And I was on the West Coast near Seattle, liberal area, and it didn't happen there. Yes, but that was definitely a time period where things got real messy that way. Something interesting. My husband and I decided to watch the first Jurassic Park with the next Jurassic World coming out. We're like, let's watch the first one, see how campy that was. And it was kind of campy because you can really see the animation now, like all the glitchiness, and it just wasn't as clear as it is today, not as real. But there's one of the opening scenes, it might be the opening scene. You see all of these workers on the island, and they are around this cage, and this cage has velociraptors in it. And one of the workers gets grabbed by one of the velociraptors, and he's being pulled in, and he's clearly being like torn up by this dinosaur. And it's terrifying. It's a terrifying scene. It's really like gut wrenching. You're like, oh, this is awful. But one thing that I noticed is there is zero blood, there is zero gore. You don't see any of the graphic details of what was happening with half of that man's body and the dinosaur. All you see him is hanging on for dear life. That's all you see, is just him hanging on, and people trying to get him out and lots of shouting and yelling, but you don't actually see any of the graphic part of it, and it's just as gripping as it would have been if they had shown all of that. Like, the effect really isn't impacted that much. It just kind of turns your stomach more if you see all the gory details, and just desensitizes you a little bit more to all of that. So interesting thing to think about. Surgeons, when doctors decide they want to be surgeons, or just doctors, they have to observe surgeries. And a lot of the time, the med students that are there in the beginning will have problems. They will puke, they will pass out, they have a hard time seeing the inside of somebody's body. But as they get used to it, they get desensitized to it, and they're able to see it without flinching. Like, I think there's a video out there of a surgeon actually doing surgery on himself, like he's doing hernia surgery or something on himself. And a normal person would not be able to do that. It would just, you pass out, like it just wouldn't be okay with you. And it's the same with the violence that we watch. The more we watch, the more desensitized we are, the more we just don't care. All right, so we had 31 mass murders in 1990s, 2000 to 2010, 44. So it's gone up a little bit more, 44 mass murders. We had 9/11 happen, we had the Iraq War, the second one, the war in Afghanistan. But also remember fatherlessness, where fathers were just absent from the home but still alive, was at 8% in the 60s. Now it's at 24%. So it has quadrupled. No, it has tripled between the 1960s and 2010. And there isn't a whole lot of data after that, because the LGBTQ movement came in and decided that the nuclear family was their problem and they wanted to destroy it. And they have convinced so many lawmakers and agencies to stop collecting data on fatherlessness, because they are trying to make men and women equal on all fronts, and saying there's no difference between a mom and a dad, and they are trying to destroy the nuclear family, and they're very open about it. They don't want kids thinking that they need to have a mom and a dad. They don't want kids thinking that it would be good to have a father. They don't want the nuclear family there because it doesn't support their agenda. Toby, oh my gosh. Sorry, it's my son. Go. I'll be done in a minute. Okay. He just got back from the pond, and he's, yes.
I just can't know your kids.
All right. Okay, so then 2011 to 2020, it jumped from 44 to 122 mass murders. And there are a lot of things that play into that. It's gone down the 3 years that we've had kind of quarantined and alone. But it's really, really telling that we made a jump from 44 to 122. And this is just a small portion of that. In 2010, I doubt teachers were showing R-rated movies at school. I just don't think that that happened very often. The fact that it's happening now, and it's happening not just at my kids' school, and I'm in rural America, I'm in Ohio, like in the country, where it just, yeah, you would kind of expect it more in a city setting, but it's happening all over the country. And not just at schools, it's happening at home. Like, part of the reason why these teachers think it's okay, one of the arguments that I hear is, well, they'll get it at home anyway. And that's just not a good argument, because, you know, there are parents that let their kids drink at home. There are parents that let their kids smoke at home. You can't go by what happens at home. And we need to raise the standard ourselves of what's happening in our homes, all of us, because this is a societal problem. It's something that has crept in. A friend of mine, I was talking to her the other day, and she gave the example of a frog. If you put a frog in a pot of boiling water, it will hop out if it can. It will jump right out of there. But if you sit a frog in a pot of room temperature water and you slowly raise the temperature, it will stay in that water until it cooks to death. And it might even invite some other frogs in. And that's what's happened in this country. We've been sitting in our pot of comfy water and it's been heating up. Wood has been added to the fire and we are cooking ourselves to death. And we're not doing anything about it because we don't realize that it's happening. And again, this is just one of the problems. There are three major ones that are really in my mind. And, well, there are two minor ones and one major one. There's a mother weed. So this is a minor weed, and weeds have to be pulled out by the roots. You have to yank them out by the roots. You can't just chop them off at the top because they just grow back and they spread. I moved it, a raspberry patch. And if you're familiar with raspberries, they're a wonderful berry. I had them in one of my raised garden beds, and I decided to move them to the other side of the house and transplant my strawberries over to where they were. And I dug them all up. I thought I got all the roots out, transplanted them, and they are coming up in all the beds now and in the lawn because they spread underneath. And if you don't get all of the root, you don't kill the plant, and it comes up everywhere it wants to, creates lots of new plants. And that's kind of what America has done. Every time there is a mass shooting, a mass murder, we immediately jump to put a Band-Aid on it. We just chop at the leaves and we don't get to the root. And our leaders use it to divide and conquer us. They immediately start pointing fingers. The right points at the left and says, "You're not taking our guns, we need more security. We need armed teachers and armed guards at our schools." And the left points at the right and says, "We're taking all your guns, we need to ban guns, guns are the problem." And our leaders are pointing us at each other, saying that's your enemy, and we are on the same team. We're in the same country. None of us want our children to die. And people are dying and being beat up and having horrible things done to them regardless of their political status. I'm pretty confident that shooter didn't walk in that classroom and ask each child, "So what political party is your family affiliated with?" I'm pretty sure that wasn't an issue there. I'm pretty sure he just didn't care. And all of the parents that have lost children, all of the people that have lost loved ones to violence, to unnecessary violence, not that it's really ever necessary, but all of them suffer, and they're from all sides. And we are one country, but we are not united, we are divided. And our leaders are dividing us because they see it as an opportunity to pit us against each other, because whoever gets more pitted against the other wins. And then they keep the power and they do nothing to help us. They don't do anything to solve these problems. So we really need to take it into our own hands and start solving them ourselves. And an easy thing to start with is detoxing ourselves from all the violent entertainment and starting to open our eyes and shield our children from it. From the entertainment, from the music, from even books, horror books that are probably not very healthy psychologically for kids to read, or adults for that matter. Pay attention to what your kids are wearing, because there's all sorts of hateful messages on clothing now. It's on snacks. There was a wrapper that I picked up on the side of the road near our school that had, it was called like voodoo potato chips or something. It had all these voodoo dolls on it with pins stuck in them. And there is nothing that you do with a voodoo doll with pins stuck in it that is positive. It's all about getting revenge, getting back at your enemies. And I'm sure some people will say, well, they use it to heal and stuff too, but they also use it to inflict damage on their enemies. And that's what this picture was depicting. And that's a snack that somebody's getting for their child, and I'm sure they're delicious. But it sends this underlying message that it's okay to harm someone because you don't like them. It's okay to do this to your enemies. And those little innuendos, they just pick at you, and they pick at our kids. And we need to start being aware of them and start cleansing our society of it. We're never going to get rid of all evil on this side of heaven, but we can certainly kick it in the face and stomp it down. So I hope you'll start being more aware. Also contact your government leaders and talk to them about getting restrictions put on content at schools, and even looking into getting restrictions put on content at home. I think it would be totally acceptable for streaming services to either have to offer edited for a general audience programming if they're going to include children's programming in their service, or just have a separate channel for adult content. I think that would be perfectly acceptable. I think most people would opt for the edited version because they don't want to pay more money. But the adult stuff that's unedited should be separated. Just like liquor stores are separated from the rest of the grocery. Yes, so contact your senators and your congressmen. I contacted a few of mine and emailed information to them. By the time I got them on the phone, we had a phone meeting last week. They had already started writing legislation. So there are a lot of good lawmakers out there that will be on the side of good and that will see this problem and will do what they can to get rid of it. But we need to do it ourselves too. So, all right, hope you have a wonderful day. And the next one will probably be on fatherlessness. And then we will go to the mother weed, which I think a lot of people might have a hard time with at first. But the mother weed is one that we have got to get out of our society. So I'll see you later. Bye-bye.